The Self by Carl Jung, from Volume 9 of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Ion. We shall now turn to the question of whether the increase in self-knowledge resulting from the withdrawal of impersonal projections, in other words, the integration of the contents of the collective unconscious, exerts a specific influence on the ego personality. To the extent that the integrated contents are parts of the self, we can expect this influence to be considerable. Their assimilation augments not only the area of the field of consciousness, but also the importance of the ego, especially when, as usually happens, the ego lacks any critical approach to the unconscious. In that case, it is easily overpowered and becomes identical with the contents that have been assimilated. In this way, for instance, a masculine consciousness comes under the influence of the anima and can even be possessed by her. I have discussed the wider effects of the integration of unconscious contents elsewhere and can therefore omit going into details here. I should only like to mention that the more numerous and the more significant the unconscious contents which are assimilated to the ego, the closer the approximation of the ego to the self, even though this approximation must be a never-ending process. This inevitably produces an inflation of the ego unless a critical line of demarcation is drawn between it and the unconscious figures. But this act of discrimination yields practical results only if it succeeds in fixing reasonable boundaries to the ego and in granting the figures of the unconscious, the self, anima, animus, and shadow, relative autonomy and reality of a psychic nature. To psychologize this reality out of existence either is ineffectual or else merely increases the inflation of the ego. One cannot dispose of facts by declaring them unreal. The projection-making factor, for instance, has undeniable reality. Anyone who insists on denying it becomes identical with it, which is not only dubious in itself, but a positive danger to the well-being of the individual. Everyone who has dealings with such cases knows how perilous an inflation can be. No more than a flight of steps or a smooth floor is needed to precipitate a fatal fall. Besides the pride goeth before a fall motif, there are other factors of a no less disagreeable psychosomatic and psychic nature which serve to reduce puffed-uppedness. This condition should not be interpreted as one of conscious self-aggrandizement. Such is far from being the rule. In general, we are not directly conscious of this condition at all, but can at best infer its existence indirectly from the symptoms. These include the reactions of our immediate environment. Inflation magnifies the blind spot in the eye, and the more we are assimilated by the projection-making factor, the greater becomes the tendency to identify with it. A clear symptom of this is our growing disinclination to take note of the reactions of the environment and pay heed to them. It must be reckoned a psychic catastrophe when the ego is assimilated by the self. The image of wholeness then remains in the unconscious, so that on the one hand it shares the archaic nature of the unconscious, and on the other finds itself in the psychically relative space-time continuum that is characteristic of the unconscious as such. Both these qualities are numinous, and hence have an unlimited determining effect on ego consciousness, which is differentiated, i.e., separated, from the unconscious and moreover exists in an absolute space and an absolute time. It is a vital necessity that this should be so. If, therefore, the ego falls for any length of time under the control of an unconscious factor, its adaptation is disturbed and the way open for all sorts of possible accidents. Hence, it is of the greatest importance that the ego should be anchored in the world of consciousness, and that consciousness should be reinforced by a very precise adaptation. For this, certain virtues like attention, conscientiousness, patience, etc., are of great value on the moral side, just as accurate observation of the symptomatology of the unconscious and objective self-criticism are valuable on the intellectual side. However, accentuation of the ego personality, and the world of consciousness may easily assume such proportions that the figures of the unconscious are psychologized, and the self consequently becomes assimilated to the ego. Although this is the exact opposite of the process we have just described, it is followed by the same result: inflation. The world of consciousness must now be leveled down in favor of the reality of the unconscious. In the first case, reality had to be protected against an archaic, eternal, and ubiquitous dream state. In the second, room must be made for the dream at the expense of the world of consciousness. In the first case, mobilization of all virtues is indicated. In the second, the presumption of the ego can only be damped down by moral defeat. This is necessary because otherwise one will never attain that median degree of modesty which is essential for the maintenance of a balanced state. It is not a question, as one might think, of relaxing morality itself, but of making a moral effort in a different direction. For instance, a man who is not conscientious enough has to make a moral effort in order to come up to the mark, while for one who is sufficiently rooted in the world through his own efforts, it is no small moral achievement to inflict defeat on his virtues by loosening his ties with the world and reducing his adaptive performance. One thinks in this connection of Brother Klaus, now canonized, who for the salvation of his soul left his wife to her own devices, along with numerous progeny. Since real moral problems all begin where the penal code leaves off, their solution can seldom or never depend on precedent, much less on precepts and commandments. The real moral problems spring from conflicts of duty. Anyone who is sufficiently humble or easygoing can always reach a decision with the help of some outside authority. But one who trusts others as little as himself can never reach a decision at all unless it is brought about in the manner which common law calls an act of God. The Oxford Dictionary defines this concept as action of uncontrollable natural forces. In all such cases, there is an unconscious authority which puts an end to doubt by creating a fait accompli. In the last analysis, this is also true of those who get their decision from a higher authority, only in more veiled form. One can describe this authority either as the will of God or as an action of uncontrollable natural forces, though psychologically it makes a good deal of difference how one thinks of it. The rationalistic interpretation of this inner authority as natural forces or the instinct satisfies the modern intellect, but has the great disadvantage that the apparent victory of instinct offends our moral self-esteem. Hence we like to persuade ourselves that the matter has been decided solely by the rational motions of the will. Civilized man has such a fear of the crimen lese messiestis humanae that whenever possible he indulges in a retrospective coloration of the facts in order to cover up the feeling of having suffered a moral defeat. He prides himself on what he believes to be his self-control and the omnipotence of his will, and despises the man who lets himself be outwitted by mere nature. If, on the other hand, the inner authority is conceived as the will of God, which implies that natural forces are divine forces, our self-esteem is benefited because the decision then appears to be an act of obedience, and the result is a divine intention. This way of looking at it can, with some show of justice, be accused not only of being very convenient, but of cloaking moral laxity in the mantle of virtue. The accusation, however, is justified only when one is in fact knowingly hiding one's own egoistic opinion behind a hypocritical facade of words. But this is by no means the rule, for in most cases instinctive tendencies assert themselves for or against one's subjective interests, no matter whether an outside authority approves or not. The inner authority does not need to be consulted first, as it is present at the outset in the intensity of the tendencies struggling for decision. In this struggle, the individual is never a spectator only. He takes part in it more or less voluntarily, and tries to throw the weight of his feeling of moral freedom into the scales of decision. Nevertheless, it remains a matter of doubt how much his seemingly free decision has a causal, and possibly unconscious, motivation. This may be quite as much an act of God as any natural cataclysm. The problem seems to me unanswerable because we do not yet know where the roots of the feeling of moral freedom lie, and yet they exist no less surely than the instincts, which are felt as compelling forces. All in all, it is not only more beneficial but more correct psychologically to explain as the will of God the natural forces that appear in us as instincts. In this way, we find ourselves living in harmony with the habitus of our ancestral psychic life. That is, we function as man has functioned at all times and in all places. The existence of this habitus is proof of its viability, for, if it were not viable, all those who obeyed it would long since have perished of maladaptation. On the other hand, by conforming to it, one has a reasonable life expectancy. When an habitual way of thinking guarantees as much as this, there is not only no ground for declaring it incorrect, but, on the contrary, every reason to take it as true or correct in the psychological sense. Psychological truths are not metaphysical insights. They are habitual modes of thinking, feeling, and behaving which experience has proved appropriate and useful. So when I say that the impulses which we find in ourselves should be understood as the will of God, I wish to emphasize that they ought not to be regarded as an arbitrary wishing and willing, but as absolutes which one must learn how to handle correctly. The will can control them only in part. It may be able to suppress them, but it cannot alter their nature, and what is suppressed comes up again in another place in altered form, but this time loaded with a resentment that makes the otherwise harmless natural impulse our enemy. I should also like the term God in the phrase, the will of God, to be understood not so much in the Christian sense, as in the sense intended by Diotima, when she said, Eros, dear Socrates, is a mighty daemon. The Greek words daemon and daemonion express a determining power which comes upon man from outside, like providence or fate, though the ethical decision is left to man. He must know, however, what he is deciding about and what he is doing. Then, if he obeys, he is following not just his own opinion, and if he rejects, he is destroying not just his own invention. The purely biological or scientific standpoint falls short in psychology because it is, in the main, intellectual only. That this should be so is not a disadvantage, since the methods of natural science have proved of great heuristic value in psychological research. But the psychic phenomenon cannot be grasped in its totality by the intellect, for it consists not only of meaning, but also of value, and this depends on the intensity of the accompanying feeling tones. Hence, at least the two rational functions are needed in order to map out anything like a complete diagram of a given psychic content. If, therefore, in dealing with psychic contents one makes allowance not only for intellectual judgments, but for value judgments as well, not only is the result a more complete picture of the content in question, but one also gets a better idea of the particular position it holds in the hierarchy of psychic contents in general. The feeling value is a very important criterion which psychology cannot do without, because it determines in large measure the role which the content will play in the psychic economy. That is to say, the affective value gives the measure of the intensity of an idea, and the intensity in turn expresses that idea's energetic tension, its effective potential. The shadow, for instance, usually has a decidedly negative feeling value, while the anima, like the animus, has more of a positive one. Whereas the shadow is accompanied by more or less definite and describable feeling tones, the anima and animus exhibit feeling qualities that are harder to define. Mostly they are felt to be fascinating or numinous. Often they are surrounded by an atmosphere of sensitivity, touchy reserve, secretiveness, painful intimacy, and even absoluteness. The relative autonomy of the anima and animus figures expresses itself in these qualities. In order of affective rank, they stand to the shadow very much as the shadow stands in relation to ego consciousness. The main affective emphasis seems to lie on the latter. At any rate, it is able, by means of a considerable expenditure of energy, to repress the shadow, at least temporarily. But if for any reason the unconscious gains the upper hand, then the valency of the shadow and of the other figures increases proportionately, so that the scale of values is reversed. What lay furthest away from waking consciousness and seemed unconsciousness assumes, as it were, a threatening shape, and the affective value increases the higher up the scale you go. Ego consciousness, shadow, anima, self. This reversal of the conscious waking state occurs regularly during the transition from waking to sleeping, and what then emerge most vividly are the very things that were unconscious by day. Every abaissement du niveau mental brings out about a relative reversal of values. I am speaking here of the subjective feeling value, which is subject to the more or less periodic changes described above. But there are also objective values which are founded on a consensus omnium. Moral, aesthetic, and religious values, for instance, and these are universally recognized ideals or feeling tone collective ideas. The subjective feeling tones, or value quanta, are easily recognized by the kind and number of constellations, or symptoms of disturbance, they produce. Collective ideals often have no subjective feeling tone, but nevertheless retain their feeling value. This value, therefore, cannot be demonstrated by subjective symptoms, though it may be by the attributes attaching to these collective ideas and by their characteristic symbolism, quite apart from their suggestive effect. The problem has a practical aspect, since it may easily happen that a collective idea, though significant in itself, is because of its lack of a subjective feeling tone, represented in a dream only by a subsidiary attribute, as when a god is represented by his theriomorphic attribute, etc. Conversely, the idea may appear in consciousness lacking the affective emphasis that properly belongs to it, and must then be transposed back into its archetypal context, a task that is usually discharged by poets and prophets. Thus Holderlin, in his Hymn to Liberty, lets this concept, worn stale by frequent use and misuse, rise up again in its pristine splendor. Since her arm out of the dust has raised me, beats my heart so boldly and serene, and my cheek still tingles with her kisses, flushed and glowing where her lips have been. Every word she utters, by her magic, rises new created, without flaw. Hearken to the tidings of my goddess. Hearken to the sovereign, and adore. It is not difficult to see here that the idea of liberty has changed back to its original dramatic state, into the shining figure of the anima, freed from the weight of the earth and the tyranny of the senses, the psychopomp who leads the way to the Elysian fields. The first case we mentioned, where the collective idea is represented in a dream by a lowly aspect of itself, is certainly the more frequent. The goddess appears as a black cat, and the deity as the lapis exilis, stone of no worth. Interpretation, then, demands a knowledge of certain things, which have less to do with zoology and mineralogy than with the existence of an historical consensus omnium in regard to the object in question. These mythological aspects are always present, even though in a given case they may be unconscious. If, for instance, one doesn't happen to recall, when considering whether to paint the garden gate green or white, that green is the color of life and hope, the symbolic aspect of green is nevertheless present as an unconscious saus intendu. So we find something which has the highest significance for the life of the unconscious standing lowest on the scale of conscious values, and vice versa. The figure of the shadow already belongs to the realm of bodiless phantoms, not to speak of anima and animus, which do not seem to appear at all except as projections upon our fellow human beings. As for the self, it is completely outside the personal sphere, and appears, if at all, as a religious mythologium, and its symbols range from the highest to the lowest. Anyone who identifies with the daylight half of his psychic life will therefore declare the dreams of the night to be null and void, notwithstanding that the night is as long as the day, and that all consciousness is manifestly founded on unconsciousness, is rooted in it, and every night is extinguished in it. What is more, psychopathology knows with tolerable certainty what the unconscious can do to the conscious, and for this reason devotes to the unconscious an attention that often seems incomprehensible to the layman. We know, for instance, that what is small by day is big at night, and the other way around. Thus we also know that besides the small by day, there always looms the big by night, even when it is invisible. This knowledge is an essential prerequisite for any integration. That is to say, a content can only be integrated when its double aspect has become conscious, and when it is grasped not merely intellectually, but understood according to its feeling value. Intellect and feeling, however, are difficult to put into one harness. They conflict with one another by definition. Whoever identifies with an intellectual standpoint will occasionally find his feeling confronting him like an enemy in the guise of the anima. Conversely, an intellectual animus will make violent attacks on the feeling standpoint. Therefore, anyone who wants to achieve the difficult feat of realizing something not only intellectually, but also according to its feeling value, must, for better or worse, come to grips with the anima-animus problem in order to open the way for a higher union, a coniunctio oppositorum. This is an indispensable prerequisite for wholeness. Although wholeness seems at first sight to be nothing but an abstract idea, like anima and animus, it is nevertheless empirical insofar as it is anticipated by the psyche in the form of spontaneous or autonomous symbols. These are the quaternity or mandala symbols, which occur not only in the dreams of modern people who have never heard of them, but are widely disseminated in the historical records of many peoples and many epochs. Their significance as symbols of unity and totality is amply confirmed by history as well as by empirical psychology. What at first looks like an abstract idea stands in reality for something that exists and can be experienced, that demonstrates its a priori presence spontaneously. Wholeness is thus an objective factor that confronts the subject independently of him, like anima or animus, and just as the latter have a higher position in the hierarchy than the shadow, so wholeness lays claim to a position and a value superior to those of the syzygy. The syzygy seems to represent at least a substantial portion of it, if not actually two halves of the totality formed by the royal brother-sister pair, and hence the tension of opposites from which the divine child is born as the symbol of unity. Unity and totality stand at the highest point on the scale of objective values because their symbols can no longer be distinguished from the imago Dei. Hence all statements about the God image apply also to the empirical symbols of totality. Experience shows that individual mandalas are symbols of order, and that they occur in patients principally during times of psychic disorientation or reorientation. As magic circles, they bind and subdue the lawless powers belonging to the world of darkness, and depict or create an order that transforms the chaos into a cosmos. The mandala at first comes into the conscious mind as an unimpressive point or dot, and a great deal of hard and painstaking work, as well as the integration of many projections, are generally required before the full range of the symbol can be anything like completely understood. If this insight were purely intellectual, it could be achieved without much difficulty, for the worldwide pronouncements about the God within us and above us, about Christ and the corpus mysticum, the personal and suprapersonal Atman, etc., are all formulations that can easily be mastered by the philosophic intellect. This is the common source of the illusion that one is then in possession of the thing itself. But actually one has acquired nothing more than its name, despite the age-old prejudice that the name magically represents the thing, and that it is sufficient to pronounce the name in order to posit the thing's existence. In the course of the millennia, the reasoning mind has been given every opportunity to see through the futility of this conceit, though that has done nothing to prevent the intellectual mastery of a thing from being accepted at its face value. It is precisely our experiences in psychology which demonstrate as plainly as could be wished that the intellectual grasp of a psychological fact produces no more than a concept of it, and that a concept is no more than a name, a flatus vocus. These intellectual counters can be bandied about easily enough. They pass lightly from hand to hand, for they have no weight or substance. They sound full but are hollow, and though purporting to designate a heavy task and obligation, they commit us to nothing. The intellect is undeniably useful in its own field, but is a great cheat and illusionist outside of it whenever it tries to manipulate values. It would seem that one can pursue any science with the intellect alone, except psychology, whose subject, the psyche, has more than the two aspects mediated by sense perception and thinking. The function of value, feeling, is an integral part of our conscious orientation and ought not to be missing in a psychological judgment of any scope, otherwise the model we are trying to build of the real process will be incomplete. Every psychic process has a value quality attached to it, namely its feeling tone. This indicates the degree to which the subject is affected by the process, or how much it means to him, insofar as the process reaches consciousness at all. It is through the affect that the subject becomes involved, and so comes to feel the whole weight of reality. The difference amounts roughly to that between a severe illness, which one reads about in a textbook, and the real illness, which one has. In psychology, one possesses nothing unless one has experienced it in reality. Hence, a purely intellectual insight is not enough, because one knows only the words and not the substance of the thing from inside. There are far more people who are afraid of the unconscious than one would expect. They are even afraid of their own shadow. And when it comes to the anima and animus, this fear turns to panic. For the psyche does indeed represent the psychic contents that erupt into consciousness in a psychosis, most clearly of all in the paranoid forms of schizophrenia. The overcoming of this fear is often a moral achievement of unusual magnitude, and yet it is not the only condition that must be fulfilled on the way to real experience of the self. The shadow, the psyche, and the self are psychic factors of which an adequate picture can be formed only on the basis of a fairly thorough experience of them. Just as these concepts arose out of an experience of reality, so they can be elucidated only by further experience. Philosophical criticism will find everything to object to in them, unless it begins by recognizing that they are concerned with facts, and that the concept is simply an abbreviated description or definition of these facts. Such criticism has as little effect on the object as zoological criticism on a duck-billed platypus. It is not the concept that matters. The concept is only a word, a counter, and it has meaning and use only because it stands for a certain sum of experience. Unfortunately, I cannot pass on this experience to my public. I have tried in a number of publications, with the help of case material, to present the nature of these experiences and also the method of obtaining them. Wherever my methods were really applied, the facts I give have been confirmed. One could see the moons of Jupiter even in Galileo's day, if one took the trouble to use his telescope. Outside the narrower field of professional psychology, these figures meet with understanding from all who have any knowledge of comparative mythology. They have no difficulty in recognizing the shadow as the adverse representative of the dark chthonic world, a figure whose characteristics are universal. The psyche is immediately comprehensible as the psychic prototype of all divine couples. Finally, the self, on account of its empirical peculiarities, proves to be the eidos behind the supreme ideas of unity and totality that are inherent in all monotheistic and monistic systems. I regard these parallels as important because it is possible, through them, to relate so-called metaphysical concepts, which have lost their root connection with natural experience, to living, universal psychic processes, so that they can recover their true and original meaning. In this way, the connection is reestablished between the ego and projected contents now formulated as metaphysical ideas. Unfortunately, as already said, the fact that metaphysical ideas exist and are believed in does nothing to prove the actual existence of their content, or of the object they refer to, although the coincidence of idea and reality in the form of a special psychic state, a state of grace, should not be deemed impossible, even if the subject cannot bring it about by an act of will. Once metaphysical ideas have lost their capacity to recall and evoke the original experience, they have not only become useless, but prove to be actual impediments on the road to wider development. One clings to possessions that have once meant wealth, and the more ineffective, incomprehensible, and lifeless they become, the more obstinately people cling to them. Naturally, it is only sterile ideas that they cling to. Living ideas have content and riches enough, so there is no need to cling to them. Thus, in the course of time, the meaningful turns into the meaningless. This is unfortunately the fate of metaphysical ideas. Today, it is a real problem what on earth such ideas can mean. The world, so far as it has not completely turned its back on tradition, has long ago stopped wanting to hear a message. It would rather be told what the message means. The words that resound from the pulpit are incomprehensible and cry for an explanation. How has the death of Christ brought us redemption when no one feels redeemed? In what way is Jesus a God-man, and what is such a being? What is the Trinity about, and the parthenogenesis, the eating of the body and the drinking of the blood, and all the rest of it? What connection can there be between the world of such concepts and the everyday world, whose material reality is the concern of natural science on the widest possible scale? At least 16 hours out of 24 we live exclusively in this everyday world, and the remaining 8 we spend preferably in an unconscious condition. Where and when does anything take place to remind us even remotely of phenomena like angels, miraculous feelings, beatitudes, the resurrection of the dead, etc.? It was therefore something of a discovery to find that during the unconscious state of sleep, intervals occur, called dreams, which occasionally contain scenes having a not inconsiderable resemblance to the motifs of mythology. For myths are miracle tales, and treat all of those things which very often are also objects of belief. In the everyday world of consciousness such things hardly exist. That is to say, until 1933, only lunatics would have been found in possession of living fragments of mythology. After this date, the world of heroes and monsters spread like a devastating fire over whole nations, proving that the strange world of myth had suffered no loss of vitality during the centuries of reason and enlightenment. If metaphysical ideas no longer have such a fascinating effect as before, this is certainly not due to any lack of primitivity in the European psyche, but simply and solely to the fact that the erstwhile symbols no longer express what is now welling up from the unconscious as the end result of the development of Christian consciousness through the centuries. This end result is a true anima, a false spirit of arrogance, hysteria, woolly-mindedness, criminal amorality, and doctrinaire fanaticism, a purveyor of shoddy spiritual goods, spurious art, philosophical stutterings, and utopian humbug, fit only to be fed wholesale to the mass man of today. That is what the post-Christian spirit looks like. And that ends The Self by Carl Gustav Jung. Thank you for listening.